From space and defense tech, let's just shift into a different space where technological excellence can also meet up with policy paradigms as it does. In an era where geopolitics and tech collide, Apple's China strategy is a playbook worth dissecting. How does Apple's China strategy play out in a complex geopolitical era? Let's dive deep into the revelatory story of how an outspoken, proud company that once praised rebels and troublemakers, the company that encouraged us all to think different and navigate Beijing's orbit, who better to talk about it than someone who drew on more than 200 interviews with former executives and engineers supplementing their stories with unreported meetings held between top executives and internal memos to put together his deeply researched and compelling, riveting book, Apple in China. Please welcome Patrick McGee, journalist and author, for a session on Apple's China Playbook, Lessons for India, in conversation with Bodhisattva Ganguly and Chandra Shrikant.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for coming to Rising Bharat. So, Patrick McGee is the author of Apple in China, which made it to basically the best business book list across publications. So, congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And it's sort of become a must-read book if you want to understand Apple and if you want to understand China. So, that's sort of two birds with one stone. But thank you very much for coming all the way from the US and participating in Rising Bharat. For the opening question for you.
So thank you, Patrick. Your fundamental premise of your book is that China has immensely benefited from the huge investments that Apple has made there. You've compared it with the Marshall Plan, which transformed Europe after the Second World War. But would it be also fair to say that China has made Apple the mammoth that it is currently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the second claim is inarguable, and I think was probably already known, which is to say that Apple just would not be able to build the products that it builds, certainly not at that quality, definitely not at that cost, but especially not at that quantity, right? They build 230 million iPhones a year. There's just not another place on the planet that's capable of doing that. But the great irony is that the reason China is capable of that is that Apple made extraordinary investments into the country over a 25-year period. And I think within the world of journalism, that had basically been unexplored. Right? So it's just like not a controversial claim to say that Apple couldn't be Apple without China. I think that's tantamount to obvious. I was making the contrarian claim that actually China wouldn't be China without Apple. And that sounds unhinged and absurd, but I think if you read the 400 pages, it's pretty convincing.
Right. The subtext of your book is that Apple has struck some kind of a Faustian bargain, with China. But, did Apple have any other alternative? Because you've also said in the book that, for the first 25 years, they pretty much manufactured their own products at a time when other companies in the industry were outsourcing. They were actually very late to the subcontracting game.
Yes.
And they also, experimented with multiple countries. I think they tried out Vietnam and South Korea and Taiwan before zeroing in on China.
Yeah, there were actually 9 different countries they manufactured their products in between 1996 and 2003, which is a pretty untold narrative. So in addition to the countries you mentioned, Mexico.
And this was driven by Steve
Wales.
Jobs, Tim Cook, both of them together.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of personalities, yes, but it was driven more by financial desperation, right? The thing that people forget is that the Apple of the 1990s was nothing like the Apple today. It was a company that nearly went bankrupt in 1996, 1997, and again after the dot-com crisis in 2000. So this was a company that got to a stage where they were so close to bankruptcy they couldn't support their own manufacturing operations, and they were forced to outsource. And there was nothing novel about outsourcing. That's what HP, Motorola, so many companies have been doing for years, if not decades. But when Apple sort of applied its special sauce of like, we're going to control sort of every facet of the product, right? We don't just care about the front, we care about the back and the insides. And of course, Apple sort of exudes a certain quality standard that nobody else really has. When they sort of brought that mentality to the likes of Foxconn, Quanta, and Ventec, these Taiwanese companies that were building up major industrial clusters in China, they just had an impact on the entire ecosystem that no company had ever had before. Again, these claims can sort of sound a little bit strange out of context, but if you remember how different the candy-colored translucent plastic iMac was versus a beige box in the PC world, right? The design was so different, and ipso facto, the manufacturing had to be so different in order for that to work.
No, I mean, as you said, I think also assembly of electronics products is as old as the 1970s, right? Semiconductors, so it's nothing new. But just to make the to make the conversation a little more forward-looking, so you've been in India. I don't know how familiar you are with India, but you've been in India for the last few days, and India is trying to fashion itself as some kind of an alternative to China in the Apple universe. How plausible is that?
So I'm pretty pessimistic that anyone's going to compete with China. It's not that I'm bearish on India in particular.
Right.
I'm just, I don't want to be bullish about China. But like, for instance, they installed more industrial robots than the rest of the world combined last year. So it's tough for anybody to compete with China. But India is in a position that no other country is in. In other words, there is not another country on the planet besides India and China that have more than 1 billion people, right, that have a sort of comparable landmass. India has, low wages and abundant workers on a scale that China had 25 years ago, and India has far better demographics than China, right? I think by 2050, China's population is going to decline by 200 to 300 million. India's is going to go up significantly, right? So I think the number of workers in India goes up from 900 million to 1.1 billion, and it already has a younger population. And, one thing that sort of is, I've been having conversations about just this weekend is that, before COVID, it was difficult to get things made in India because companies would say it's just going to be easier for us to do it in China. But now, because China plus one strategies are such a big deal for any corporation that's dependent on China, it's not that India is actually having to compete with China, it's having to compete with everybody else, right?
Yeah.
In other words, the whole game is, I don't want to make everything in China, where else can I go? So by definition, you're not having to compete with China, you're competing with Vietnam or something like that. And in that respect, India has great potential. So the question is, can they realize that potential? And that's a question I'm still grappling with. And I have days where I'm optimistic, I have days where I'm not so optimistic.
But some a preliminary assessment?
What's my assessment?
Yeah, what's a sort of an initial
Honestly,
assessment?
the one thing I worry about is that sometimes I read the Indian media and there's a little too much hype, I would say. In other words, I would emphasize that this is a multi-decade play. And sometimes my sense of speaking with people or reading the media is that India already thinks it's achieved something that's comparable to China in certain sectors. So I'll give you one example because this one gets hyped up all the time. People will talk about iPhone production and they'll give the value of the iPhones that have been exported. This is sort of an absurd, ludicrous figure because it's forgetting that the value of the export of the iPhone is largely based on imported componentry, mostly from China, also from Taiwan and Korea, and you're in effect counting that as you export it to, let's say, the United States. So your former Reserve Bank of India governor, Rajan, wrote a great paper where he basically showed that, yes, the exports for electronics or smartphones in particular for India look like this over the last decade, but if you just add another tab for it, net imports of all the componentry, it also looks like that. And so the net value is actually minimal versus the full value. And so I think that's not a wonky point, that's a really important context that India's not at the stage where they're actually building the iPhone, they're doing the final assembly. And if you're going to build out the full-out ecosystem, that's a multi-decade play.
Right. In fact, let me just add a follow-up to that. Like you said, the number that gets touted, at least now that even Tim Cook mentions I think India more frequently now in his quarterly earnings call, and India now accounts for, I think, 1 in 4 of all of Apple iPhones globally. And I think Apple is targeting a 30 to 32% share by FY27. But as you said, it's not so much make in India, but assembled in India, because a majority of the components still flows through China. So, how many years will it take to get that entire ecosystem together? Because you don't just need Apple, you need all their suppliers and their tier 2 suppliers and tier 3 suppliers. So, will Apple sort of encourage all of them to come here?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to one supplier who said Apple was pushing them like hell to set up shop in India, right? So I think from Apple's perspective, they really need this to happen. But it's not just a matter of the companies, it's a matter of the governments, right? Not really just the federal government, I mean, that has to be a play, but it has to be the local governments, right? Thing that people get wrong about China all the time is they think it's a top-down government where whatever Beijing says is how things operate. I quote someone in the book calling China an RDA, a regionally decentralized authoritarian regime, where the local governments have a lot of say with how they are going to implement the policies that Beijing wants. Now, obviously, you're not going to copy and paste, a communist, template onto India, but I don't see any particular reason why there wouldn't be more cooperation at the local level to sort of get things done, right? So if Modi is going to have a certain plan, I mean, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, the places where you're going to have the Apple supply chain can respond, but they can respond in ways that they see fit. And that's going to be working with the Taiwanese companies. You absolutely need them. I mean, I think everybody all over the world should be courting the Taiwanese as much as possible. It's a small little island of 24 million people, has technical expertise, tacit knowledge, the process knowledge in their heads like nobody else. I mean, there's no chance that Apple would have been successful in China without the Taiwanese establishing all the factories and taking care of the politics for them. It's really important also that you have an anchor company like Tata, because Foxconn, Wistron, Pegatron, these companies' expertise is not Indian politics, right? In China, they had the advantage of a shared culture, a shared language. They don't have that in India. So you need companies like Tata to step up, which, to be fair, is what's happening. The question is sort of how quickly is it happening? And then gauging how successful it is a little bit tricky, because on the one hand, you'd think, oh, wouldn't Apple really want to tout how much they're doing in India? And some days, yeah, but other days, no, because they're so entangled with China that the last thing they want to do is hype up how quickly they're de-risking. I've always said that the Chinese, I think appropriately, see the iPhone as an indigenous product. It's been made in China since 2007. The closer, or the more that Apple invests in India, the greater risk there is that the $70 billion market in China, right, the 1.2 billion people there, begin to see Apple as the corporate poster child of de-risking from China. That's not good for Apple revenue or profits, and indeed for their relationships with local governments and with Beijing. So everything that's going on in India is a little bit murky because Apple doesn't want to help tell that narrative.
So just to kind of follow up to that, how much influence does the Chinese government have over a company like Foxconn, for instance, in terms of, discouraging it from moving to India? It already has moved to India. It has a big presence, and also some of the component suppliers. I mean, how much of a role could the Chinese government play potentially? I
mean, I'll give a slightly historical answer if that's okay. So, the meet cute moment before Apple and China got married was really in Shenzhen, right? And Shenzhen was this specific region where, in a sense, Chinese communism didn't apply. It was basically a capitalist experimentation zone. And Apple got comfortable in that environment, not quite realizing that it was not really China in a certain sense. And so in 2013, Xi Jinping comes into power, and this is the opening prologue of the book, where Apple has a real wake-up call, right? This becomes the political awakening for Apple, where they realize that they don't actually understand the country. They don't understand the politics, they don't understand the culture, and they're in crisis believing that the iPhone and other Apple products might be blacklisted from the country.
That's the hostile customer service reviews.
Yeah, it's a really complicated episode, and it sort of hadn't been told well before, but it involves way too much complexity for certain things here. But I'll just say the problem extends to like the world of shadowy gangsters in China and distribution across the whole country, and it's a pretty fascinating narrative. So Beijing sort of becomes part of the picture, if you will, in 2013. And the influence that they have actually on Foxconn today, it's not directly on Foxconn, it's more that China's at this stage where they're sort of done with the idea of being a low-value haven for labor-intensive assembly. They very much want to move up the value chain, and over the last 25, even 40 years, if you're extending back to the area of textiles, they very much earn their place there, and so they have their own companies that are rivaling the likes of Foxconn. So the last 10 years in particular, Foxconn and other Taiwanese companies have really been sort of squeezed out of the Apple supply chain because Apple is playing the political game there, and it knows they're reading the tea leaves. It makes a lot of sense to choose Luxshare, Gore-Tex, BYD, and Wingtech. These are Chinese companies that the Taiwanese call the red supply chain. So the pressure doesn't have to be direct on Foxconn. It's more the wider game and the fact that Apple knows that to build not customer relationships, government relationships, it needs to work more closely with the Chinese rather than the Taiwanese.
Yeah. We were talking about how Apple tried out 9 different countries, but they eventually settled on China. So can you give us a sense of the incentives that the Chinese government gave to Apple in terms of cost and labor? You mentioned how, there were truckloads of people ready to be deployed in these factories in China. Given that India's overall economy is 1/5 the size, should we be cautious about the kind of incentives that we offer to Apple?
Yeah, I mean, I tell these sort of case studies of the original iPod and a computer called the iMac G4, which I would even say today is my favorite designed computer. It sort of looks anthropomorphic. It's supposed to look like a sunflower, but the first commercial ever was like showing that it could break dance kind of thing. It was a really cool computer with some personality. And these case studies were effectively building computers in Taiwan, in Taiwan, but with help from Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand. And what happened was, because Apple's this perfectionist company and they would go through something like 19 prototypes for that computer, they were effectively, going across bodies of water all the time to sort of fit things together, and then be able to fly it all the way to California to show Steve Jobs. And it was just like a real headache to do this. And at the same time, China was really developing what I call next door manufacturing, where if you sort of picture like a hub and spoke model, you might have the Foxconn final assembly, but next door or across the street would be the plastic injection molding, the anodizing, the metal stamping, tool and die making, all sorts of things. So you had the formation of these industrial clusters where just everything was there, and so much of it was basically custom built for the likes of Apple. That just made Taiwan or Vietnam just totally uncompetitive versus what China was capable of doing. But India absolutely has that capability, right? That's why the local officials would have to be involved, because it's not just a matter of one company setting up shop, it's there having to be like an entire bonded zone, right? A scientific park where there might be tax exemptions, right? Because things are being built for export. There might be certain leniency, there might be special domains for the land to be utilized by a range of companies. There might be all sorts of tax exemptions. I know it can be controversial to sort of set up tax exemptions for foreign companies because you want to support your own companies, but I feel like the ladder to get up to the middle value, the higher value, really starts at the lowest rung. And so I do support the efforts of India doing chips, the deal with Micron, that kind of stuff is fantastic, but I also think India has the potential, the capacity that really nobody else has because of India's scale to also do the labor-intensive roles. The problem there is that I say that, and then I fully know that the next question could very well be about, well, what about AI? Isn't AI and machinery sort of, saying goodbye to those labor-intense roles? And yeah, I mean, so you might need a higher paid consultant or something rather than a journalist to tell you exactly what to do, because I'm not sure. But that is a risk there. I mean, it's not a clear answer. You can't just completely replicate what China did, but I do think there's all sorts of lessons from Shenzhen that India could be applying.
Yeah.
Right.
We do have a couple of questions on AI, but just one quick last question on India. Given that India is a democracy, and the Samsung factory in Tamil Nadu, which is also a major site of manufacturing of the iPhone, the Samsung factory has seen prolonged strikes. I think it's now been sorted out, but I think there were two strikes, if I'm not mistaken. So indeed of some of the iPhone facilities, which I guess was absent in China. and even if they did happen, I think didn't last very long.
Right.
That's certainly a differentiator, perhaps, and not necessarily an advantageous one for India, right?
So look, you're absolutely right. I mean, I hate to say that an authoritarian model has certain advantages,
Yeah.
and I'm certainly not going to advocate that we try to replicate those. But a democracy that withholds human rights and sorry, not withholds, stands up human rights and so forth, is also going to have advantages on its own. Now maybe they're less obvious, but companies care about what their supply chain looks like, right? They know they're going to be audited. They know there's media reporting on this kind of thing, and so if you are working in democracies where there is reporting on that, maybe that suffers in the short term. Maybe you've got some headlines that as a company you'd rather not have. But on the other hand, the transparency, the ethics of having a clearer supply chain with human rights, I mean, A, that's better for the world, and hopefully that can be better for a company's image. Is it better for the bottom line? I'm not sure. I think, frankly, it is more difficult for Samsung to make phones in Korea than it is for Apple to make phones in China, but I would hate for people to draw the wrong lessons from that.
Right. Patrick, there was also a significant announcement where Tim Cook said that Apple will spend more than $500 billion in the US over the next 4 years. They're going to be expanding in Michigan, Texas, California, Arizona, Nevada, and a bunch of other states. They're talking about setting up factories there. Is this optics to keep Trump happy, or, is it real reshoring and build baby build that's happening in America?
There was also the gold coin.
Yeah.
Look, I think it's probably 90% optics, maybe 95% optics. I wouldn't say that Apple's doing nothing, right? But the impetus is certainly politics. And I think from the last 12 years of pleasing an authoritarian leader in China has given them the wherewithal to please an authoritarian ruler in Washington. But yeah, the $600 billion figure, it's basically like, it's clear that it's a bullshit figure. How it is bullshit is up for debate. So I have speculated that they're counting their own share buyback program, which itself is more than $100 billion a year. You multiply that by 4 and you're 80% there. It is possible that they're counting other things, but like, for instance, when I count Apple's investments in China, I'm never counting the bill of materials, the aluminum or the glass that's in the phones, that's certainly not the chips, etc. Apple, I think, is counting that when they're adding up the figures in America. So when my colleagues in the journalist world at places like Bloomberg have tried to add up the math and they look beyond Apple, they quickly realize they're doing a bunch of double counting, because TSMC and NVIDIA and an Apple all might be counting the Arizona fab as, in some sense, theirs, with maybe some justification, but not one that would pass by an accounting expert.
Right.
So you gave the example of in your book of that Apple is like Prometheus, which gave the gift of fire to China. So is there a similar playbook playing out perhaps in AI chips? I mean, there is this debate in the US. Obviously, Jensen Huang wants to sell AI chips to China because his argument is that China is a huge market, which the US should not lose. There are others like, Dario, who is, of course, in the news for other reasons as of this morning, but who doesn't agree with this. What are your thoughts?
So like on NVIDIA being...
No, not on NVIDIA, but on AI chips generally, AI technologies, and how much US companies should, collaborate with China and operate in the Chinese market. Yeah.
Right, so there is this big...
In terms of selling chips to China.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one. I mean, I could sort of extend an analogy from the book, which is that Trump 1.0 basically tried to kill Huawei in a certain sense, right? So it deprived Huawei in 2019 of Qualcomm chips and 5G technology that was coming out of America, as well as Google services, right? So, Google Mail and things like that already were banned in China, but like Huawei had a global business, and if all of a sudden they couldn't have access to the Play Store, to Gmail, to YouTube, no one was going to buy those phones. It, over the long term, I don't think was successful in the slightest. So 2019, people might forget, but Huawei outsold the iPhone, not just in China, but globally. I mean, it was a real threat to Apple's business. And when Trump went after Huawei, it halved their revenue. They went, if memory serves, from $60 billion handset business one year to $30 billion. And because Huawei was the only company really ever from China to penetrate the top tier of the smartphone chain, Apple was the chief beneficiary of Huawei's demise. However, the demise was not, seen all the way through. Huawei sort of knocked their heads together and worked as hard as possible, and now they're sort of back and bigger and better than
they're
ever.
developing the Ascend chips.
Well, so my analogy to chips is that if you're a China hawk, you would say, absolutely, let's not give them any access to American chips. But by doing so, you're also sort of providing them like the necessity is the mother of invention type mentality, where China is probably going to become better at building their own chips. So the soft approach to China is to say what Jensen Huang says, which is let's get them hooked on American AI. And yes, they're going to be able to build up their own AI systems more quickly because we're giving them the world's fastest chips, or even the second fastest, but at least it's on an American tech stack. So I honestly think both arguments are pretty good, and if I was a policymaker, I'm not sure exactly how I would do it.
The counter-argument to that is China will drop the American tech stack when the Chinese tech stack manages to overtake them.
True, but the more wedded you are to the American tech stack, the less quickly you would have the money and impetus to build your own, right? In other words, to just go back to the analogy from earlier, Huawei now has its own operating system called Harmony OS. They never would have built it if they weren't deprived of Android, right? So in the same world, in the chips world, if you deprive them of having any NVIDIA chips whatsoever, that's going to put the Chinese into overdrive to out TSMC to out NVIDIA. If they just have access to those chips, they don't have the same drive. They might still think logically they'd like to do it, but it's a question of sort of degree and urgency.
Right. Final question, Patrick, because we're running out of time. If you had to write an Apple in India book today, how many chapters is likely to have? Do you think you will at least have 2 chapters for this book?
Well, there is a section on
Chapter 40
India.
of your
Yeah, there you go.
book.
So that's one chapter written. I've also written a new epilogue for the edition that comes out in May, and it has more to say about India. So let's call that 1.5 chapters. But look, the thing I would like to do is the same thing I do in the book. So, arguably, if someone else was writing the Apple and China book, they might have started in the iPhone era. They might have started in what I call the political awakening. But I chose to go way back to the 1980s to explain the rise of contract manufacturing, which actually took place in Alabama. With the IBM PC before the rise of the Taiwanese, before the rise of China. And so I might want to do the same for India. I daydream about writing Apple in China all the time, right? It's too early. I said yesterday to someone, in the government that I want to write it by 2035, and they said, it'll be too late. You got to write it by 2029, I mean, I love that mentality. I love the idea that India is going to surprise us with how quickly they can be. But that would be fascinating. But I think you'd want to give the long history of India maybe not being part of the supply chain, explain the reasons why, and maybe that would have me writing about, the rise of the software, consultancy, IT sectors, all the things that India did well over the last 25 years as an explanation as to why manufacturing was the missing link in like the civilizational pyramid or something like that, right? So maybe it's not a great idea, but I haven't started the research.
Great.
We look forward to that if it happens.
I mean, look, I'm only going to write it if India achieves excellency in the supply chain, and I'm absolutely cheering for India. So please do it. I would love to write that book.
Great. On that note, thank you very much, Patrick, for coming all the way from the US and speaking at the Rising Bharat
Thank
Summit.
you so much.
And if you haven't read Apple in China, please check it out. Thank you.
Thank you.